The summer of 1943, and the sound of iron wheels shrieked against the sun-baked tracks as the train rolled into the small, dust-swept station. Farmers paused their work. Children climbed fences to see the strangers arriving. Men in faded gray uniforms, faces hollow from months of war and surrender. The soldiers of Hitler's once proud army had come to rest in the heart of the American South. When the train doors opened, the German prisoners squinted into a light so bright it seemed unreal. Their boots hit the gravel with heavy, uncertain thuds. They had imagined America as a land of machines and cruelty, the enemy's den. Yet what greeted them was silence. No jeering crowds, no raised rifles, only the rustle of grass, the scent of dust, and the slow creak of a flagpole carrying the stars and stripes in a lazy wind. One soldier, barely 20, shielded his eyes and whispered, "So this is the enemy." Another, older and bitter from campaigns in Africa, muttered, "Don't trust it. This is how they break us." But there was no chain, no whip, just an American sergeant, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, instructing the men to line up. His voice was stern, but not cruel. Behind the barbed fences stood rows of low wooden barracks, freshly painted. Beyond them stretched fields of wildflowers, shimmering blue under the sun. Bluebonnets, the Texans called them. The Germans watched in disbelief as local men in wide-brimmed hats unloaded supplies, nodding politely to the prisoners. Some even smiled. It was a strange kind of captivity. They were enemies, yes, but the air carried no hatred. The guards offered water. The farmers, curious, brought baskets of peaches. A few American soldiers stood by their jeeps, watching quietly, perhaps wondering if these young faces could ever have pointed rifles at theirs. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the prairie gold, the camp lights flickered on. Inside the wire, hundreds of weary men sat in silence, trying to make sense of this new world, a place where the sky stretched farther than any prison wall they had ever known. And for the first time since their capture, a question began to stir among them. What if the enemy they feared was not as monstrous as they were told? The prairie night grew quiet, but their hearts were restless. Something unfamiliar was blooming: curiosity. The morning sun crept across the Texas plains, igniting the dew that clung to the wire fences like silver threads. Inside the camp, life began to unfold, not with drills or shouting, but with the hum of quiet routine. The German prisoners woke to roosters crowing in the distance, the scent of coffee drifting from the American guard's tent, and the laughter of farmhands outside the gate. For men who had known only the thunder of artillery and the stench of gunpowder, it felt surreal, a prison surrounded by beauty. The fences loomed high, yet beyond them stretched meadows painted in blue bonnets, cattle grazing lazily under a sky that never seemed to end. A few of the prisoners began to tend small gardens, coaxing vegetables from the dry soil. Others built chairs, painted signs, or strummed makeshift guitars from scrap wood and wire. They called it the camp within the camp, a fragile world carved out of captivity. From the watchtower, an American guard leaned against his rifle, squinting down at the men below. He saw not soldiers of an enemy army, but young faces burned by the same sun that bronzed his own. When one of the Germans waved, the guard hesitated, then raised his hand in quiet return. A small gesture, gone unnoticed by most, but it carried the weight of something dangerous in wartime: understanding. As days passed, the rhythm of the camp changed. The Germans sang folk songs in the evening. Their voices drifted through the barbed wire, blending with the cries of cicadas and the lowing of cattle beyond. Local Texans, driving by on dusty roads, would sometimes stop just to listen, the melody foreign yet hauntingly human. But not all hearts found peace so easily. Beneath the calm, a quiet tension pulsed. Some prisoners refused to work the fields or speak to their captors, believing kindness was a trap meant to weaken their loyalty. Others felt guilt that they could eat well, sleep safely, and laugh under the same flag their homeland had sworn to destroy. One night, as the sky turned violet, a prisoner named Wilhelm stood near the fence, staring at the wide fields beyond. "They call this the land of the free," he murmured, his voice low. "Strange, isn't it? We came here in chains, and yet I have never felt air this open." The man beside him didn't answer. He just watched as fireflies began to gather over the grass, blinking softly like silent witnesses. Inside the wire, the world felt both infinite and confined, a contradiction that none could fully name. It was in this uneasy stillness, between beauty and captivity, that something began to shift. The line between prisoner and man, between enemy and neighbor, started to blur. Beyond the fences, unseen but approaching, rode the sound of hooves, and with it, the next turning of fate. It began with the sound of hooves, steady, rhythmic, and close. The Germans looked up from their morning chores to see a line of riders approaching through the dust. Cowboys, real ones, wide hats tilted low, bandanas loose around their necks, lariats coiled at their sides. To men who had once marched through the ruins of Europe, this was like a scene from another world. The riders slowed near the fence, their horses snorting clouds of dust. Curiosity drew both sides closer. The Texans, hardened by sun and saddle, had heard about these krauts held behind the wire, Hitler's men, now reduced to gardeners and woodcutters. They expected cold stares, maybe arrogance. Instead, they found men who looked just as human, just as weary. One cowboy leaned forward, spat into the dirt, and grinned. "Y'all ever ride?" he called out. A few Germans exchanged puzzled glances. One laughed nervously. "Reiten," another translated, uncertain. The cowboy mimed the motion, holding imaginary reins, bouncing in his saddle. The Germans chuckled, some shaking their heads. Others stepped closer to the fence, intrigued despite themselves. That small gesture, a joke across languages, cracked something open. Over the next few days, the cowboys returned. They brought cigarettes, swapping them through the fence. One even handed over a harmonica, which a German played that evening by the fire. Slowly, suspicion began to fade, replaced by a hesitant camaraderie born of shared dust and boredom. Then came the invitation. One morning, the camp commander, a fair-minded Texan major, announced that local ranchers needed extra hands to help break in a herd of wild Mustangs. Volunteers would be chosen from among the prisoners of war. The Germans were stunned. Freedom, even for a day? Some whispered it was a trick, a test of loyalty, or a trap for escape. Others couldn't believe Americans would trust their enemies with horses, let alone let them ride. Yet curiosity overcame fear. A few men stepped forward, including Wilhelm and a former cavalry officer named Otto. They were loaded onto a truck, driven past the gates, and out into the open Texas prairie. For the first time in years, the air around them carried no wire, no walls, only the vast horizon. The cowboys greeted them with wary smiles. "You boys ever met a Mustang?" one asked. Otto answered softly, "Only in stories." The cowboy grinned. "Then you're about to meet freedom itself." The first horse they brought out was a storm of muscle and defiance. It kicked, snorted, and spun in wild circles. The Germans instinctively stepped back, but the cowboys only laughed. "Don't look at him like an enemy," said one, tightening his grip on the rope. "You gotta earn his respect." The words hung in the air, simple, yet strangely profound. Enemy. Respect. Both sides understood. As the sun climbed higher, boots hit dust, ropes flew, and for the first time, laughter replaced suspicion. Cowboys shouted encouragement. Germans tried and failed and tried again. The fences of war, at least for that afternoon, felt a little farther away. By sundown, something irreversible had begun. Not peace, not friendship exactly, but understanding. And as the Mustangs stamped their hooves into the golden soil, the Germans couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow might bring. Because tomorrow, they would ride. The Texas sun blazed high as the first Mustang tore across the corral, its muscles rippling like fire under its hide. Dust erupted in golden clouds, and the shouts of cowboys echoed across the plain. The Germans stood behind the fence, spellbound. This was not war, not training, but raw defiance made flesh. The horses were wild, unbroken, and free. When the gate swung open for the first volunteer, a hush fell. Otto, the former cavalry officer, stepped forward. His eyes, once cold and disciplined, now carried the quiet thrill of a man facing something purer than battle. The cowboy handed him a worn leather saddle. "He won't make it easy," the Texan warned. Otto only nodded. "Neither did life," he said softly. As Otto mounted, the Mustang exploded beneath him, rearing, twisting, fighting against every hand that dared to control it. Dust filled his lungs, the sun burned his face, and the world spun in violent circles. The cowboys shouted advice. The Germans shouted encouragement in their mother tongue. For a moment, Otto was no longer a prisoner. He was a man wrestling the wild, as alive as the wind. The Mustang bucked, then stilled. Otto leaned forward, his hand on the horse's neck, breathing hard. When he looked up, the cowboys were clapping, whistling, laughing. One of them tossed him a canteen. "Not bad, Kraut," the man said with a grin. "Guess freedom rides the same everywhere." Otto took a long drink, smiling for the first time in years. One by one, the others tried. Wilhelm, the young dreamer. Kurt, the painter who once marched in Poland. Even Hans, who had refused to speak to any American since capture. Each took their turn, falling, rising, learning to balance between fear and trust. And each time they rose from the dust, they laughed, not because they forgot who they were, but because, for a few brief hours, it didn't matter. By noon, the air shimmered with heat and joy. Cowboys and Germans worked side by side, tying ropes, tending horses, trading curses and jokes in broken words. Someone shared a loaf of bread, someone else passed a bottle. The barriers of language melted beneath the sound of shared laughter. As the day waned, the sky turned copper, and shadows stretched long across the fields. A cowboy named Eli sat beside Wilhelm, who nursed a bruised arm and a wide smile. "Y'all ride like the wind's been waiting for you," Eli said. Wilhelm looked out at the horizon. "Maybe it has," he replied. The two men sat in silence for a while, watching the Mustangs graze beyond the corral. The horses moved with quiet grace, no masters, no orders, just instinct and sky. "Funny thing," Wilhelm murmured, "to find freedom in a place built for prisoners." Eli tipped his hat. "Freedom's not a place, son. It's how you ride what's trying to throw you." The words lingered like dust in sunlight, simple, wise, unforgettable. As the Germans climbed back onto the truck that evening, the camp's fences no longer felt the same. They had seen something that couldn't be unseen, that freedom wasn't given or taken, it was lived. The guards noticed the difference too. The men who returned were not the same as those who left. Their eyes carried a new light, one born not of defiance, but of understanding. That night, as the wind swept softly through the camp, Wilhelm lay awake listening to the creak of the barracks and the distant cry of coyotes. His muscles ached, but his heart felt weightless, He realized that the horse he had ridden, the wild, furious creature that refused control, was no different from himself. And in that thought, he found a strange kind of peace. The stars hung low and endless above the Texas sky. For the first time, the men behind the wire didn't feel captured. They felt alive. And as they drifted into sleep, one truth pulsed quietly between them all. Sometimes, even in chains, the soul learns how to ride free. Autumn crept over Texas softly, painting the prairie in amber light. The days grew shorter, the air cooler, and the Mustangs, once wild and furious, now grazed calmly near the camp's edge. Life within the fences had found a rhythm, one stitched together by routine and fragile peace. The German prisoners had built furniture for the townsfolk, repaired tractors, painted murals on the barracks' walls. Laughter had returned to their voices. But when the work ended and silence fell, a different sound filled the air, the scratch of pencils on thin paper. Every evening, men sat on crude wooden benches, writing letters home. "Dear Mother," one began, "I am alive, though I no longer know what side of the world I belong to." Another wrote, "The Americans, they treat us not as enemies, but as men. It confuses me." Some wrote about the horses, the vast skies, and the kindness of the cowboys. They described peaches, music, and laughter, things their families back in Germany could no longer imagine. But with every word, guilt crept in like dusk. How could they smile while their homeland burned? How could they eat fresh bread while their comrades starved in Russian snow? The moral weight of survival pressed heavy upon them. Wilhelm sat by the fence one night, his half-written letter trembling in his hand. Beyond the wire, the fields glowed faintly under the moon. He thought of his father, a proud man who had believed in victory at any cost. What would he think of his son now, laughing with cowboys, finding peace among those once called enemies? Across the yard, Otto strummed his guitar, humming a tune that floated through the quiet. The melody drifted toward the guard's post, where Sergeant Miller leaned back in his chair, listening. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the emotion. It was the sound of men remembering what it meant to be human. Some nights, the prisoners gathered near the fence just to talk, not about war or politics, but about home. They compared rivers, told stories of their mother's cooking, their children's laughter. The Americans listened too, sometimes joining in with tales of their own, of rodeos, harvests, and dances under the stars. For a few moments, the world felt smaller, gentler. Yet even as connection bloomed, unease lingered. Rumors drifted in with the wind. The Allies had crossed the Rhine, cities lay in ruin, the war's end was near. The prisoners cheered and fell silent. For them, peace meant release, but it also meant facing what was left of home. Wilhelm finally folded his letter. He wrote the last line slowly. "I am learning that enemies can share kindness, but I fear I have forgotten how to hate." He sealed the envelope, unsure if it would ever reach its destination. As he rose, he saw the faint shimmer of fireflies along the fence line, the same kind that had glowed the night they arrived. For a moment, he imagined each light carrying a message across the dark ocean, tiny lanterns of forgiveness. He pressed his hand against the wire, feeling its chill. The fence no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a boundary between two worlds, one that was ending and one still being born. And in the quiet hum of Texas night, the letters kept coming, not just to Germany, but to history itself. Spring of 1945 arrived with a restless wind. The Texas plains bloomed with wildflowers, but within the camp, something heavier hung in the air: anticipation. Rumors had turned to certainty. Germany had surrendered. The war, at last, was over. The announcement came on a morning wrapped in sunlight. The prisoners gathered near the loudspeaker, their faces drawn tight with disbelief. The American commander read the words slowly, almost solemnly. Germany has laid down its arms. The conflict in Europe has ended. For a moment, there was no cheer, no cry, only silence. Some bowed their heads, others stared blankly at the horizon. The world they had fought, hated, and endured for had vanished in a single sentence. That afternoon, the camp changed. Guards removed the strict routines. Doors stayed open longer. Letters were written again, but now they began with uncertainty. "We are going home, though I no longer know what home is." Word spread that the first group of prisoners would leave within weeks. The Texans who had worked beside them, the cowboys, the farmers, the cooks, came to say goodbye. The Germans stood in rows as the Americans approached, hats in hand. There were handshakes, awkward at first, then firm, heartfelt. Eli, the cowboy who had taught Wilhelm to ride, found him by the corral where the Mustangs grazed. "Guess it's time," Eli said quietly. Wilhelm nodded, his eyes tracing the horses' silhouettes against the setting sun. "I never thought I'd miss a prison," he replied. Eli chuckled softly. "That's 'cause it wasn't one." Not really. A whistle blew, the sound of the same train that had once brought them in under guard. Now, it waited to take them home, free men carrying invisible scars. The prisoners gathered their few belongings, carved trinkets, letters, bits of rope, and small wooden horses they'd whittled from Texas cedar. As they boarded, the cowboys stood by the tracks. No one shouted, no one saluted. It was a farewell too full for words. A few of the Germans raised their caps in silent gratitude. Others simply looked, trying to memorize the wide sky, the smell of dust, the echo of laughter that had once crossed enemy lines. The train began to move, steel grinding against steel. The prairie rolled past like an old dream. Wilhelm pressed his hand to the window, watching the camp shrink until it became a blur of fences and fields. But his eyes lingered not on the wire, nor the barracks, but on the horizon, that endless, open line he had once ridden beneath the same sun as free men. Inside the carriage, Otto whispered, "It's strange. We came here as soldiers. We leave as something else." Wilhelm nodded slowly. "Men," he said. As the train carried them eastward, the wind slipped through the cracks in the window, warm and familiar, smelling faintly of sage and soil. It was as if Texas itself was bidding farewell, not to prisoners, but to a part of its own story. And though the fences were miles behind, something of that land would stay with them forever. The sound of hooves, the kindness of strangers, and the knowledge that even the heart can find freedom behind barbed wire. Long after the trains vanished into the eastern horizon, the Texas wind still carried echoes of their laughter, faint, like the memory of a song. The camp was dismantled, its fences pulled down, the barracks left to the grass and time. Only the fields remained, wide and unbroken, where once men from opposite worlds had stood on either side of the wire. Years later, townsfolk would tell stories about them, the German boys who learned to ride Mustangs, who carved toys for local children, who sent letters home describing kindness instead of cruelty. Some of those letters survived, tucked away in family trunks across the ocean, their words yellowed but still alive. In them was a quiet truth. Captivity had not broken them. Compassion had reshaped them. For the Texans who had met them, the memory lingered too. Cowboys who had fought the land all their lives came to realize that courage wasn't just found in taming wild horses. It was in seeing humanity in the eyes of an enemy. The war had taught them how to fight. Those prisoners taught them how to forgive. Freedom, they both learned, is not a gift of borders or flags. It is something wilder, older, a spirit that cannot be fenced. The Mustangs knew it. They ran with the wind, unclaimed, untamed, just as the human heart yearns to be. And perhaps that is why the Germans, though far from home and burdened by loss, found a strange solace in their company. For in the rhythm of hooves and the rush of open air, they rediscovered what the war had stolen, the simple grace of being alive. Decades passed. Some of those former prisoners returned to Texas, gray-haired and slow, walking again among the same rolling plains. They found nothing left of the camp, only the rustle of grass and the distant sound of horses. But in that emptiness, they felt presence, as if the land itself remembered. One of them, Wilhelm perhaps, whispered to the wind, "This was where I learned what freedom truly means." And somewhere, in the vast stillness of the prairie, a mustang cried, not in mourning, but in motion. Its gallop faded into the distance, a heartbeat echoing across time. The story of those men, once enemies, now brothers in memory, remains unwritten in history books, but alive in the soil of Texas. It reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, compassion rides unbroken, wild as the horses that once thundered across those plains. For in the end, it wasn't the fences that defined them, nor the war that separated them, but the courage to see the human heart where the world demanded only hate.